Come back into the room if you're here for podcasts, talking personally at scale. We'll be talking about how journalists are using podcasts to talk personally at scale with some of the best in the field. Robbie Allenpay, Basia Cummings, and Susanna Olenijak. I'm sorry about that. Moderated by our outstanding Preeti Nalu, who's writer, researcher, filmmaker, advocacy specialist, and IPI friend. Preeti's now with Report for the World and Report for America, which has been doing so much great work in helping to support newsrooms, local newsrooms particularly, and has now expanded globally, and Preeti leads that part of the project. And of course, Ground Truth, the overall organisation, has been a long-time IPI member. So I'll pass it to Preeti to introduce the panel and get going.
Right, well, thanks to everyone who's here for our panel where we'll be talking about storytelling through podcasts. Indeed, investigations led by podcasts have grown both in popularity and impact over recent years, and they bring a number of strengths to the field of journalism. To start with, they personalize complex reporting through voice and sound. They've proven to create more audience engagement, especially when they have live components. They have narrative styles, for example, a serial way of telling stories that draws the audiences in and is more likely to create loyal listeners. And finally, they tend to be more accessible compared to traditional media. And to talk about some of these topics, I am joined by founders and editors at 3 such focused long-form podcasts that have produced investigations with significant reach and accountability. And so in the interest of time, I'd like to jump straight into the first round of questions where each panelist will talk about a particularly impactful investigation or series of reporting as a way of introducing their specific setup and some of their methods and approaches to investigative podcast journalism. To quickly introduce myself, as Jackie just mentioned, I'm with Report for the World, which is a journalism service program, and we support specialized reporters in independent media across the globe. We're in 32 newsrooms across 20 countries, and we currently support 45 reporters. And so, Basia, if I can start with you. At Tortoise Media, you are essentially creating a slow news movement, and you're challenging the dissonance from daily dissonance from breaking news. Yeah. But you're also looking at some of the structural inequities in power through technology, business, and society, right? And so Hoaxed is one of your most impactful investigations to date. And what makes it really interesting is that it is a very locally situated story where you started to see more global repercussions or global consequences to it as you continue to report. And this is just one example, and you might have several others on your slides. But I wanted to know how the unique setup of your team and your newsroom allowed you to get deeper into this reporting.
Well, I should start off by saying that Tortoise didn't start as an audio newsroom. We started 4 years ago thinking that we would be an investigative newsroom based in London and that we would be publishing long reads and articles. And we quickly realized that it wouldn't work because there was already so much being published in the UK. It's a very competitive market. And we had to think again, I think, as a startup, how are we going to connect with people, and what are the kind of specific skills that we want to get out there in terms of investigations and storytelling. And so we started to think about audio, and we were lucky that we had some people from the BBC who were working with us also, who we were able to start experimenting with pilots. We hired some producers, and then suddenly it felt like, and I'm sure if other people here have built newsrooms or news businesses, it suddenly felt like something clicked into place, that our investigative skills as journalists made so much more sense when applied to audio, that we could be open in a more honest way because we could show our workings, we could show who we were as journalists. We could be slow in the sense that we weren't chasing headlines and breaking news. So it felt like there was some chemistry there that we could really do something with. And the podcast that we started making, we have a weekly investigative podcast. I'm not sure if you can switch a couple of slides, you'll be able to see on the screen. We have a weekly investigative podcast where every week we have a different, sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's business, sometimes it's world news, it's a real mix. And that's a kind of representation of who we are as a newsroom. So all of our journalists may be working on projects that will appear on that podcast. That's called the Slow Newscast. But we also do limited investigative series. So the one that you mentioned, Preeti, is Hoaxed, which was a 6-part or 8-part series, I should know, which was about a hoax that took hold of one particular community in London. And it was a story about a group of essentially mothers whose lives had been turned upside down by this lie that had been told about sexual abuse in their community. But what it was really about is how online narratives can have real-world harm and impact, and how, in our case, the British police has not caught up with that, with how to police or look out for that harm. And so it was sort of all the things that we hope that podcasts can be for our journalism right there, which is taking a specific story, making it global, looking at bigger themes. And I mean, there's been plenty others that we've published in the last 18 months that follow that kind of format.
Thank you for that. And so you were looking at a local story with global repercussions. And one of the things that Outliers talks about in the mission statement is covering global stories with local repercussions. And it's also interesting to see that your team explicitly talks about dismantling this sort of artificial divide between local stories and global affairs. And Susanna, you've worn several different hats. You've been a social events manager, you've produced investigations in your team, and one of them is Into the Wasteland, which I think is an excellent example of approaching a story with this sort of mentality. And Into the Wasteland is about basically illegal waste from England reaching different parts of the world as far as Indonesia, right? And so that was a mammoth undertaking with several reporters, and the production value is high, but you still have this personal narrative, a human narrative. Could you run us through a bit of what that took?
Yeah, hello everyone. That's true, actually. The Into the Wasteland was a quite interesting part of what we are doing as a podcast team in Outriders, because it was a collaboration with our friend from England, and we've been invited to be part of this project in this Polish section, because just like you mentioned, the story is quite international, and this investigation was quite a big thing, I would say. And thanks to this international cooperation, it's the way we work all the time, since day one, since the beginning, that the value that we think is quite important is to have people on the spot, because they know what's going on best. So when we took part of this Polish part, it's been quite eye-opening what's going on our part in Poland when it comes to this whole waste case. But thanks to that also, it opened our eyes on the way we work with the reporters all around the world, because from the beginnings of our podcast, the way we work is we're always trying to collaborate with people who are in the region, or no matter if it's on Asia or Africa, or this is sea countries, because really believe that they know their work best, and that's the way we try to work with the narrative podcast, and both if they are connected with the investigation, or if they are more connected with the podcast from Ukraine, because for obvious reason we had a lot of podcasts connected to Ukraine topics, and we just started 3 days after the full-scale war began in Ukraine. So first 16 episodes were connected directly to Ukraine, and they were published every 2 or every 3 days from Ukraine. And after that, we just decided to go more into international affairs, just to make sure that people in Poland knows that something else also is going on in the world. So, so the production, when it comes to both investigation and different aspects of this podcast, is quite similar, I would say, because no matter what topic do we choose, it's trying to get the best quality and the best people in the field.
And I imagine your audience has changed since the invasion of Ukraine, and I'd like to get back to you on audience engagement in a few minutes. But before that, Robbie, I'm sure a lot of these things about collaborations working across borders resonate with you because you've worked across Asia. And at Puma Podcast, you describe yourselves as an enterprise podcast production. And you've also shaped some of your shows around audience interests. And Catch Me If You Can, which is a show on disinformation and Report for the World, is supporting a full-time journalist on the team, and we're thrilled to do that. This particular show has gained local, national, and global audiences. Could you run us through your approach where you decided to partner with a world-renowned disinformation expert? How did that change your audiences? And you also approached the storytelling through the lens of psychology and socioeconomics. We'd love to know more about that.
Yes, thank you for that. Well, a number of things that I have to acknowledge and also qualify. We partnered with Jonathan Corpus-Ong, who is a fellow at Harvard University, also at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, also a Carnegie Fellow, all for his work on disinformation. And conveniently, he happens to be Filipino. So that is one of the things that really provided a very convenient link for us to reach out. We reached out also at a very crucial time. We were heading into the elections in the Philippines in 2022. And we were very mindful of the impact of disinformation, that disinformation was having in forming the narratives and really shaping and influencing voter thinking. Not just in terms of voter preference, but even in terms of the larger narratives that have been going on since the return of democracy in the mid-1980s. Some of the crucial things that we saw from the start was, as Filipinos had a very big interest in disinformation, we were also very aware that the international community was very interested in the Philippines as a petri dish, as it has been said, for disinformation. So we saw this as an opportunity from the very start. I won't say that we were that smart that we could see how this would go from the start, but we did think that there can be an aspiration here to go from national to regional to global even. Another conscious decision was because we were working with an academic and a researcher, we did pair him with a reporter on disinformation, one of our senior reporters on disinformation, but we made the decision that the tone will be driven by the academic research of Jonathan Corpus-Ong. And that was crucial because Catch Me If You Can its entire methodology is not just exposing, but having conversations with disinformation agents at every level. Keyboard warriors, influencers, all the way to agencies that are taking accounts from politicians and handling the money, shaping the strategy, and so on. And had we not embraced and let Jonathan as an academic lead that conversation, the honest truth is a lot of those people would not have spoken to investigative journalists. We've adopted a number of styles, we've dramatized some voices, until eventually just 2 weeks ago, it built up to actually interviewing one of the top trolls in the Philippines, one of the most notorious. And it built up to the point that she spoke on record with her own voice, with her own identity. And it sort of became controversial because people felt, well, where's the pushback? Right? Where's the real-time fact-checking? Right? Notwithstanding constant reminders with every episode that, if you listen all the way from episode 1, this is not a forum for debating. This is not a time where we will be bringing out receipts and so on. The objective was to let you hear how they think, and then a processing before and after the conversations of how uncomfortable it was. Just quickly fast forwarding on the impact of this project, 2 weeks ago, IMS held a disinformation learning forum in Chiang Mai, Thailand, with Burmese, Indonesians, Thais, and so on, because they had picked up on the conversations. They specifically asked for Jonathan Corpus Ong to deliver a keynote address, not just about the podcast, but about the research that framed the podcast as well. And now it so happens, quite conveniently, that our reporter on this got accepted. They were nominated for the Society of Publishers in Asia award. So we're still waiting for that. It's a finalist. But partly on the strength of that credibility, our senior reporter for that, Kat Ventura, has been accepted on a scholarship to Columbia University. So now, the big excitement for us is we're going regional, and we're thinking, what are the possibilities for Jonathan and Kat now that they're in the same time zone in North America? And so that's where we want to bring the conversation.
That's a lot of different things coming together that, there's a bit of serendipity there as well, but a lot of strategic thinking. And so what resonates among all of your, examples is the personal touch. And this personalization seems to be at the bottom of, or at the root of creating more dedicated audiences. And so if we take that step further, it's those dedicated audiences that are most likely to subscribe or to become members. And Basha, your model at Tortoise Media is based on memberships. If you could explain what that looks like, and also, are you seeing that more in-depth reporting is leading to more revenue or audience engagement? What are some of the formulas that are working?
It's a good question, because I think everything is an experiment in our industry, in that nobody has quite figured out how to make news and investigations pay, and we all know that they're not lucrative. So our model started as we're a membership organization. Some of our work is available for free, but if you want to access things sooner or you want no advertising, then you can become a member. And the messaging there was not, initially the messaging was not just you're a subscriber, but you're a member of our newsroom, you have a seat at our table, you can come to events, you can participate in our editorial discussions. Once we reached scale, that's a much harder thing to propose, because one of our investigative series, Sweet Bobby, has now had 11 million listeners. Not all of them are paying to listen, and not all of them are interested in us as a newsroom. They're interested in the product. And so the question for us is, once we reached scale through podcasting, how did we try and retain a link to our audience and build loyalty? So one of the things that we've now introduced is a sort of supporter tier, so people can can contribute when they've listened to something that they feel particularly moved by or enraged by or excited by, and they can support our newsroom in that way. We still have a membership model, so people who pay a yearly subscription can still participate more deeply in our journalism. But we also have revenue that comes from off-platform advertising, so we run our podcasts on Apple and Spotify and all the other places, and that brings in some revenue. And also we have, people, particularly when you're working in the narrative sphere, which I'm sure lots of people here will acknowledge, there's more interest in the IP, so from film and TV. And I think that always sounds more exciting than it is. It's generally conversations that take ages, and then the return is not enormous, but still. So it's quite a diversified model of revenue. But saying that, at the heart of it is stories that people care about. And the more people you can reach, the better quality, the more open, the more engaging, the more creative and thoughtful your journalism. I think it comes down to that in the end people will want to support that. And I think we are moving away from a world where everyone expects to get high quality journalism for free.
Absolutely, and thank you for reminding us that we're still often at the experimentation level, especially with small media setups. But it's said time and again that one has to have a basic revenue model and some form methods of monetization in place before starting a media venture. But we know that sometimes in journalism, when initiatives are started by editors and the newsrooms do not have the sustainability experts, this is not necessarily thought through in advance. But Outliers has been quite strategic from the very beginning when it was a digital newspaper, when it was a digital newsletter. And so how have you seen, Susanna, the types of audience engagement, but also kind of creating those revenue models? Have they changed with the podcast? Is it vastly different from how the magazine and other aspects work?
Well, I would say that because of the moment when we started the podcast, and it was just like I mentioned, the beginning of full-scale war, I would say that this moment in particular, it was really something big for the whole Europe and for the whole world. So the people's interests were very narrowed down by what's going on in Ukraine. So I would say that especially at the beginning, our audience for the podcast was people who wanted to get some knowledge about what's going on right now, what's going on in this day-to-day situation behind our border. So I'd say that during that time and during the last 18 months, people had changed a little bit. They are interested much more into international affairs, not only in geopolitical scene in Europe, but I would say that actually our audience in Outriders, they are all people who are interested mostly in what's going on in the world, not only and not particular in Poland, but with this global context that may understand what's the systems and what's going on in Poland because of the other aspects in different countries. So I would say that not every year we had that big situations, and that this was really this was something unusual for us starting the podcast just in this really hard moment and hard time. So the market in Poland back then was connected mostly to war in Ukraine, and a lot of podcasts right now and our competition is connected to geopolitical and war-connected podcasts, I'd say.
So there are peak moments that sort of trigger these initiatives, so you don't always necessarily have the time to think of what's our strategy with revenue. You do the journalism because that is what is needed. Again, that might resonate a lot with how Puma Podcast has evolved, and then you're working with a very tough media landscape, but also a lot of audiences, especially within the country, that are remotely located that might not be able to pay for the content. but these are also listeners who need the information most. So how do you reconcile with this, in the sense that you need to create sustainability within your newsroom setup, but you also want to reach diverse audiences?
Yeah. Our number one properties are the ones focused on journalism. Whether you're measuring for impact or whether you're looking for regular audience. We have a daily news podcast 5 times a week. And then I'm glad you mentioned that it's not breaking. We actually have that mantra that we say explicitly in every show: thinking, not breaking. And we drop that every single day, every afternoon. That accounts for about 50% of all the traffic that we get every month. But unfortunately, as a lot of people know, whether it's the daily news or the more aspirational, investigative, and narrative stories that we produce, news is also the hardest to sell. So we had to create also a suite of products that were friendlier, not just to sponsors, not just to commercial brands, but also to civil society, NGOs, development agencies, and for that matter, other media companies in the Philippines. So our business model from the very start, when we started, was we knew we wanted to get in early on production specifically for journalistic enterprises. We were far from being the first in podcasting. I mean, there was already a Cambrian explosion similar to the blogging wave in the 90s. But we knew that getting in, particularly on a high level of production, was the space we wanted to occupy, because we felt that if we could develop the expertise there and the credibility there, we could overcapacitate and then sell our production capacity. So we've been producing, for example, the podcasts of the biggest newspaper group in the Philippines. We've produced podcasts for foundations. We've produced podcasts for banks and so on. The other thing we did was then, while we were doing that and trying to, get a little bit of support from that, we invested in educating the audience and the agencies and the potential clients on the different metrics that they could look at, other than the traditional metrics that they would ask for. We got support from Splice Media to conduct the first market study in the Philippines for podcasting, which helped us, but also became our calling card for everyone, so that even if they weren't going to buy from us, they would sit down from us for a briefing on that. The happy thing is that as that supported our own production for our own content, we actually built up an archive over 4 years, on which we now are generating anywhere from 80 to 100,000 plays a month, and that's a figure that took us 2.5 years to do, and now we're doing it every month. And our aspiration now is, to get to 200,000, 250,000. I wish we could do an 11 million download thing, but it's a good round number. It's a good round number, and now we can actually say that as we produce packages, and there are 3 or 4 different packages from that, from strict advertising to sponsorship to co-branding to branded content to exclusively produced for you, we now are honestly able to say that we do have, as part of the revenue model, monetization of our content on that. We now also have, after we shifted to this company called Acast, we also now are also able to take advantage of programmatic advertising that Acast is developing for podcasts.
Again, a lot of different, as you mentioned, Basha, diversification of revenue models, right? And it is worth creating, I think, networks where we can exchange that information and look at sort of the lessons learned. But stepping aside from the revenue, there's also diverse story formats. And so in your newsroom, how do you decide between if a story is worth being a print published in print or whether it's more of a podcast story, especially when they're both investigative in nature?
Well, I have to say, I think in the last sort of 2 years, we haven't really thought about print. We've started to think of ourselves as audio first. So all of the biggest investigations or the most ambitious sort of long form projects will have a home in audio, but we do have daily newsletters that are also featuring original journalism, but are operating in a different mode. So really, yeah, I guess where other newsrooms have a kind of text-based core, and from that they develop podcasts that sort of reflect parts of that core. So if you think of the New York Times, they've released a new podcast called The Headlines, they've got The Daily, they're sort of mining the newsroom that they have in text for audio products. I guess we think of ourselves as the inverse, which is that we have an audio core, but from that we can develop live events, text pieces, we can, as you were saying, we can do bespoke podcasts for commercial partners. So at the core of what we do is audio, and from that we can then diversify from
The repackaging is still important because it extends the shelf life of the story. Jackie, do we have a few minutes for questions then? Okay, we'd love to open up. Okay, fantastic. On mic.
Thank you. My name is Walid Batrawi from Palestine, board member, IPI. My question is about maintaining editorial values. We've been, as journalists, we have been trying our best, especially in conflict zones, to maintain our editorial values and impartiality, objectivity, etc. And we're talking about talking personally. How is it difficult for you, or not difficult, to maintain your editorial values when you're talking personally? I mean, as a Palestinian journalist in a conflict zone, I'll be accused of violating editorial values if I speak personally. So I'm not sure how would you maintain editorial values.
It's a great question. Within the context of Ukraine, maybe you could lead that conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think especially when we've been in Ukraine from the day one in last year, the situation was quite different for us, because Poland is a country who helped Ukraine when it comes to this humanitarian aid, and a lot of Polish media were there on the spot. What we have found for the whole year was the gratitudes, was the being helpful on the spot. And personally, I would find it really overwhelming how happy they were just to they wanted their story to be told. So the situation was quite different for us, because we thought and we knew that the story is quite important, that the need is important to say about that, because after first 6 weeks, of course, different topics went on the agenda in international media. So we knew that we had to deliver next stories about the Ukraine, and we have found that in Ukraine, in Kiev, in Lviv, in different Ukrainian cities, people were very helpful. So that actually helped us also with delivering the stories, with giving the values, and with sending this message to our audience. So fortunately for us, each time we go there, it's like people are really happy to see us.
Asha?
I have a slightly different approach to, I guess, I don't see there is a distinction, but I don't see a conflict between editorial values and a person, because podcasts are not newspapers of record. We don't have to just, we're not the New York Times, not the Guardian, we're not the Times. We don't have to say exactly what happened, and that's not why people come to us. They come to us for a deeper understanding of a story. They come to us to engage with our journalists. And I think the value of podcasting is that you can show those values so much more openly and intimately because you're in somebody's ears. They're often hearing you make your mind up about things, hearing the process of journalism happening in real time. And I think that doesn't mean you have to be objective, doesn't mean that you have to be completely fair and balanced in every moment. But if people are understanding why you're coming to certain conclusions or after certain interviews, how you've synthesized that information, I think there's an openness there that means that those two things are not at odds with each other. I think if you were pretending to be objective while also being a person, then that might feel a little difficult, but I'm not sure that's what people want from podcasts.
And just to add to what you said, the very reason why audiences go to local media that are smaller is because they're looking at stories that are directly relevant to them. So that by default makes it personal, but doesn't necessarily always compromise the objectivity. So just different role, I suppose. And Robbie?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think all of us, especially me coming from print for 2.5 decades, you'd like to think that there's a line. In podcasting, the reality is I've been on either side of that line. But I think it's important to understand why people appreciate podcasts. I do think people who fall in love with podcasts fall in love with the humanity of hearing voices. I actually tell my team, go out and look for people with accents. Go out and look for people who you can hear, even from their voices. This is not a middle-class Filipino, right? And immediately, I also then on the other side have to remind my team that you can write as neutrally as possible, but the voice editorializes. The music choice editorializes. You can insert a pause. You can insert just a split-second pause, and you can suggest a stutter as if somebody is insincere. So there's a lot of ways to cheat on either side, or to be good, or to be faithful to the values that we have. In all of that, my fallback is on the truth that I believe that transparency mitigates for a lot of things. And so when we start experimenting, and everything I agree is an experiment, when we start experimenting with, op-eds, can we have op-eds as podcasts? Then it was an inelegant way of titling the podcast. Here's an op-ed, here's the title. But we tell everyone, this is a podcast. I'll be honest with you, when President Marcos won in the May elections, there was an existential reflection going on among young journalists and journalists in the Philippines. And the existential question for them was not, why did Marcos win? The existential question for everyone is, why am I still doing this job when apparently nobody wants to listen to me? Nobody wants to, when apparently my journalism has lost its reach and influence, and people were down. And that was the first time I experimented with an op-ed. And it started with me remembering a line from David Letterman the week after 9/11. And I remember that very powerfully. David Letterman just sat at his desk and he said, if I'm going to keep doing this show, you're going to have to let me ramble on. And you're going to have to let me think out loud for this moment. And that was a line that I used in this first op-ed on ours, me reflecting on how could Marcos come back? And then at the same time reflecting on the reality that, but I need my government to work, right? And many people are much more desperate than me in wanting to see a successful government. So where do we draw this line? I used that line. I dropped the 9/11, the 9/11 reference because I don't want anybody thinking that I'm equating the elections with 9/11. But I said that. I said, this is me thinking out loud. And so that's my catch-all answer for every time I have a dilemma, transparency mitigates against a lot of things.
And it's a powerful personal touch to the show. Other questions?
Thank you very much. I'm Francois Mrad II. I'm from Ivory Coast. Before I put my questions, I would like to come back to what one of the panelists said, that we produce podcasts because sometimes we love the humanity. We produce podcasts to help the humanity. And I worked for media for 10 years, and without getting any salary, any wage. And at the end, I've decided to make a small fields of vegetable to help me change the economic model of my press, my own media that I've started to create. And I've decided to produce or to realize podcasts. But the questions that I'm asking is to know, as a freelance journalist, to what extent is possible to get a good partnership in order to help me, make my broadcast publish in some media, because I love the humanity, but at the end, before loving the humanity, you need to eat before. How can I get partnership with media for my podcast selling? The second question is that before producing a podcast, you need the required tools and technologies. Thanks to God, with the artificial intelligence, sometimes we get support or help with ideas. Is there, or are there some communities or foundations that can really support freelance journalists or media in the producing of a podcast? Thank you.
Sure. Would you like to talk about the workshop?
Yes, right after this, I'm doing a workshop which answers some of those exact questions about how to find partnerships and all the rest. So maybe we can answer those questions there. So you should come.
Any others from the audiences? Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Laura Saarikoski from the Helsingin Sanomat of Finland. So I represent a big newspaper that's also producing some podcasts, a few this year, much more next year. And we are in the process of sort of thinking what is the kind of a premium content that audience really appreciates in podcasts. And that is basically my question to you all. If you, when you have experience of asking money for podcasts, what kind of a content do you think is most valuable to the viewers, or listeners, sorry. Thank you.
Well, I suppose it also depends on whom you're asking, but some thoughts on different stakeholders and their interests.
We've applied for grants, both on the project level, also on program level, for the company as a whole. We are a company, by the way. We are a for-profit. We have never actually asked for money for any specific project. Relating to our audience, right? We have not created a paywall or a tier that gives them additional access for something, let's say, of a higher level. We have tried what we call, it's not a membership program per se, but we have tried what we called a tip jar. Literally just saying to our friends and followers, if you like what we're doing, would you give us a tip? And we did that really just as an experiment to start, just to see if this is something that can generate, we set a target, and can we hit that target or even exceed that target? We exceeded the target, by 1,000%. It's not very big, but we exceeded the target. And in exceeding that target, we get to report back to institutional funders and the grant makers that we do have partnerships with, that we have built relationships with, and then we tell them this is the feedback. This is genuine engagement that we can report. It's genuine numbers. It's tangible numbers, and it's evidence of impact. And that's how we sell it. Which is the best content is really, it's really up to you. It really depends on how well you know your audience. I wouldn't categorize it in any way, whether it's a full narrative and a full production to even just a hot mic conversation with somebody who's really famous. It really depends on your audience and how you understand them.
Susanna, have you seen a difference in certain audiences who are willing to pay, or certain type of content that is more likely to be paid
Well,
for?
I might just agree with Robbie. There is, I wouldn't say there is a premium context like that will be better for you. It's more about understanding the audience, or developing the styles and the ways that you have checked already that were good and people's interest were high. It's, I would say, much more about personality and about the story and about being convinced that the things you're producing, they are good, they are with your own values, with your own attitudes, because people may not know what they will love or what they will treat as a premium product. So I would go more into the guts and more into the feeling that doing this collaboration with, also we are producing with different media organization in Poland, that's knowing the audience, knowing the market, and brainstorming with different media organization gives us also a good results when it comes to the content.
Basha, you have different tiers in your membership model, and are you seeing certain type of content going behind certain tiers?
Yeah, I mean, only because we've sort of experimented with this, I can give a specific example, which is that where we have a limited narrative series, so where every episode you're kind of driving to the next one, and we find that having bonus episodes at the end of that is really powerful, because by the time you get to the end, if you've listened to the whole thing, you just want more. And so whether that's a kind of behind the scenes conversation, a sort of how we made this, how we did this type conversation has proved quite useful for us. Probably, to be honest, the biggest driver of subscriptions related to a podcast was when we did a windowing strategy. This is slightly boring and technical, but we can talk about it after, which is where you publish for the general public later than you do for your members or subscribers. And so particularly when we had something that was kind of addictive to listen to, like Sweet Bobby, people would pay to listen to the next episode much sooner, and that we saw a big rise in subscriptions. But that's not necessarily sustainable, because that is related to a specific show and not across the entire network. So it's really, like these guys saying, it really depends on the audience. It's a real mix and match, and it depends on the show. But definitely holding some things back and treating them as things that are sort of special, and I guess more transparent, that we found has driven subscriptions.
Well, perhaps it's wise conserving some of our energy and curiosity for the workshop that Basha is leading shortly. So with that, we come to the conclusion of this panel. Thank you for joining us, and we're around to answer any other questions.